You know that moment when the ground seems to shift under your feet, not from an earthquake, but from the quiet unfairness of the people who are supposed to have your back. And that's exactly what happened to me back in my senior year of high school in that ordinary split-level house in suburban Ohio, where families like mine scraped by on factory wages and big dreams that often hit hard walls. I was 18 years old, full of fire about heading to community college for the nursing program, convinced that with my grades and a solid application I could secure a scholarship to cover most of it. But I still needed a little help from home for the extras like books and fees that added up quicker than anyone admitted. So one evening after dinner, with the smell of meatloaf still hanging in the air and the TV droning in the background, I sat down with Mom and Dad at the scarred oak table that had seen 1,000 family talks, and I laid it all out in what I hoped was a convincing pitch, explaining how this was my shot at something real, a career that could lift us all out of the paycheck-to-paycheck grind that had defined our lives since Dad's last big layoff at the auto plant. My voice carried that mix of hope and nerves as I detailed the costs, keeping it to just a couple $100 more than they might expect, and I watched their faces for the encouragement I craved, only to see Dad glance away toward his coffee mug while muttering about how budgets were tighter than ever with the bills piling up from medical stuff and car repairs, his words landing like a door closing softly but firmly. Mom jumped in right after with her signature sigh, the one that always signaled defeat before the conversation even wrapped up, telling me in that weary tone that they simply couldn't spare a single dollar right then because times were too tough all around for anyone to take on extra burdens, and as much as she wanted to see me succeed, reality had to come first in a house where every penny felt like it was being stretched thin over too many needs. I swallowed hard against the disappointment rising in my throat, nodding like I understood, because what else could I do in that moment when challenging them might just lead to more excuses or worse, an argument that tore at the fragile peace we maintained. So I forced a smile and said I'd figure it out somehow, retreating to my room upstairs where the walls seemed to close in with the weight of it all, leaving me to stare at the ceiling and wonder if my ambitions were just too much for a family that prioritized survival over aspirations. But life in our neighborhood didn't pause for personal heartaches, and just 2 weeks later, as I walked home from school through the crisp fall air that carried hints of changing leaves and distant bonfires, I spotted it gleaming in the driveway like an intruder that didn't belong, a brand new black Ford truck with chrome accents catching the sunlight and tires that looked ready to conquer any road, parked right where my future was supposed to take shape if only a little support had come my way. Jake, my brother who was 2 years younger and still riding the wave of high school popularity with his basketball buddies and easy grin, burst through the front door just as I approached, keys jingling in his hand like he'd won some lottery we all knew wasn't fair. And he couldn't contain his excitement as he dragged me over to admire the beast, explaining how Mom and Dad had surprised him with it that morning because it was meant for his future, something practical to help with job hunting after graduation or even getting to trade school if he decided on that path down the line. I stood there in the driveway, the gravel crunching under my sneakers as I absorbed the sight of this expensive gift that contradicted every word they'd fed me about financial strain, feeling a sharp twist in my gut that mixed betrayal with a burning resolve. Because how could they claim no dollars for my tuition when thousands had apparently materialized for his wheels, turning what was supposed to be a shared family struggle into a glaring display of favoritism that hit especially hard coming from parents who'd always preached equality in our modest home. Dad emerged from the garage wiping his hands on a rag, pride swelling in his chest as he clapped Jake on the back and launched into a monologue about how the truck would build responsibility and open doors in a world that valued reliability. While Mom hovered nearby avoiding my gaze entirely, fussing with a dish towel as if the hypocrisy unfolding right there wasn't worth acknowledging. I didn't let the anger erupt in a scene that would have given them the upper hand or made me look like the ungrateful one, choosing instead to play it cool with a nod and a comment about how it really did look future-proof. My words laced with just enough sarcasm to hint at the irony without sparking a fight, and as the afternoon wore on with everyone gathered around the new addition to our lives, I slipped away to the backyard where the old swing set creaked in the breeze, sitting there long enough to let the initial shock settle into a plan that would carry me forward on my own terms. The scholarship application became my lifeline in those following days, with me pouring hours into it at the public library on their clunky computers, crafting essays that wove in tales of perseverance from our working-class roots without diving into the painful details of the favoritism that had pushed me to this edge, and by some stroke of determination, or perhaps the universe tipping a scale, the acceptance came through with full tuition covered, though I'd have to hustle for room and board through jobs and whatever else I could scrape together. Packing my duffel bag for the move felt bittersweet, a tangle of excitement for the independence ahead and the ache of leaving behind a family that had chosen sides so clearly. But as I zipped it shut in the quiet of my room, voices drifted up from the living room below, Mom's tone sharp and insistent, Dad's grumbling in response about having to protect Jake after what happened with his own brother years ago, the words cutting off abruptly as footsteps headed my way. That overheard snippet froze me in place in the hallway, my bag slung over my shoulder and heart pounding with questions about some buried family history they never shared. Hints of old debts or mistakes that might explain, but certainly didn't excuse the imbalance they'd thrust upon us siblings, leaving me to wonder if the favoritism ran deeper than just gender lines or economic whims. Shaking off the chill, I shouldered my way out the door into the late afternoon light, determined to build a path without their shadow, but that fragment of conversation lingered like a promise of complications yet to unfold, pulling at the edges of my resolve as I walked toward the bus stop that would take me to my new beginning. And, in a small act of balancing the scales that brought a secret smile to my face amid the uncertainty, I waited for the perfect opportunity a few days later when Jake carelessly left the truck keys on the kitchen counter while he was off at practice, and with no other ride available for my crucial scholarship follow-up interview across town where the bus schedule just wouldn't cooperate, I took the chance to borrow it quietly, sliding into the driver's seat and feeling a rush of empowerment as I navigated the familiar streets in that symbol of their preference, acing the interview with stories of grit that masked the family fractures fueling my drive. Returning it with the gas gauge dipped lower than when I'd left and a subtle scuff from my hurried parking, I acted innocent when Jake discovered the usage later that evening, shrugging off his complaints about the mileage and the faint scent of the campus cafe clinging to the seats by reminding him lightly that sharing the future-building machine could teach valuable lessons in flexibility. Watching his frustration build while Mom and Dad exchanged uneasy glances that spoke volumes about the cracks already forming. Driving away from home for good that final time, the truck's temporary role in my story fading behind me, I carried forward a spark of satisfaction from that witty detour, yet the overheard words echoed, building a suspense around what other secrets might surface to test the independence I'd fought so hard to claim, leaving everything hanging on the edge of revelation as my college life loomed just ahead. Arriving at the Ohio State University campus marked a turning point that blended the thrill of new beginnings with the undercurrent of isolation from the family fractures I'd left behind in that Ohio suburb, where the dorms rose like concrete sentinels against the sprawling lawns and the air carried a mix of autumn leaves and distant traffic from the highways that connected everything back home. I hauled my duffel bag up 3 flights of stairs to a room that smelled faintly of stale pizza and fresh paint, sharing it with a roommate named Sarah who chattered endlessly about her sorority plans while I unpacked quietly, my mind replaying the truck incident and that overheard argument about Dad's brother as if those moments defined the invisible baggage I carried. The scholarship letter crinkled in my pocket, promising full tuition coverage, but demanding I handle room and board through whatever jobs I could land, so I dove into orientation week with a determination that masked the ache of knowing my parents would sooner celebrate Jake's deliveries in his shiny Ford than send a care package for my late-night study sessions. Classes started with a whirlwind of biology lectures and nursing prerequisites that challenged every ounce of focus I had, but the evenings brought the real test when phone calls home revealed the widening gap. Mom's voice overly bright as she described Jake's part-time gig at the warehouse, where the truck proved indispensable for hauling boxes and impressing the bosses, Her updates laced with that subtle implication that his path was the practical one while mine remained some abstract pursuit. I nodded through those conversations from the payphone in the dorm lobby, the receiver heavy in my hand as I balanced books and a tray of cafeteria food, forcing enthusiasm for Jake's successes even as resentment simmered, because each story about his steady paychecks highlighted the dollars they'd withheld from my dreams, turning what should have been shared pride into a one-sided narrative that left me feeling like the outsider in my own family story. To make ends meet, I picked up shifts at the campus cafe where the steam from espresso machines mixed with the chatter of students debating exams and weekend plans, my tips adding up slowly alongside the exhaustion that came from juggling 12-hour days. But those moments behind the counter became my quiet rebellion, serving lattes with a smile that hid the calculations of how many more hours until I could afford textbooks without dipping into the emergency fund I'd scraped from summer lawns. Friends started forming in those early months, girls from my nursing cohort who shared notes and late-night ramen, but when they talked about family visits or supportive calls, I'd deflect with humor about my do-it-yourself dynasty, joking that independence was the family heirloom no one else wanted, though the light tone couldn't fully erase the sting of holidays approaching when everyone else planned flights home, and I faced the prospect of turkey dinners in the dining hall with strangers. One crisp weekend in October, with the campus trees ablaze in reds and golds that reminded me of home drives I'd never take again, I decided to head back for a quick visit, borrowing a bike from Sarah to get to the bus station where the ride felt longer than the miles suggested, each bump in the road stirring memories of that driveway revelation and the resolve it had sparked. Pulling up to the house, the Ford truck dominated the space as always, Jake revving the engine in the street with a couple of his buddies, showing off features like the sound system that blasted country tunes while Dad watched from the porch with that approving nod. The scene so normalized in their world that it almost made me question my own grievances until Mom spotted me and pulled me inside for the obligatory kitchen chat. She fussed over a pot of soup on the stove, her questions about college coming fast. How were the classes? Did I miss home? Was the food decent? But underneath lurked that patronizing edge. She mentioned how sure I was that nursing was worth the hustle, contrasting it with Jake's truck as the truly practical investment that would pay off sooner in real-world terms. I bit back a retort about practicality being selective in our budget, laughing it off instead with a quip about how my cafeteria shifts were building character faster than any vehicle ever could, but the burn lingered as I helped set the table, noticing the stack of bills on the counter that they'd once cited as too overwhelming for my tuition needs. Later that evening, after dinner where Jake dominated the conversation with tales of warehouse escapades enabled by his ride, I excused myself to the den under the pretense of grabbing an old photo album for nostalgia's sake. But curiosity drew me to Dad's desk where a drawer sat slightly ajar, papers peeking out like secrets begging to be uncovered. Rifling through cautiously with the house-settling sounds masking my movements, I found the loan documents for the truck confirming the hefty price tag, but tucked beneath were faded letters referencing a long-standing debt from Dad's side, specifically tied to his brother Uncle Ray's disastrous business venture in the 90s that had nearly bankrupted the family and left lingering obligations they were still chipping away at yearly. Phrases jumped out about protecting the next generation from similar pitfalls, with Jake's name circled in notes as the one to invest in for stability, implying I was somehow the risk they could afford to let fly solo, a calculated favoritism rooted in past traumas rather than mere oversight, the discovery twisting my understanding of their choices into something more insidious that explained the overheard argument but deepened the betrayal. Heart racing, I committed the details to memory and closed the drawer just as footsteps approached, rejoining the family with a composed face while questions swirled about how deep this family ghost ran and whether confronting it would heal or just widen the wounds. Returning to campus the next day, the bus ride back allowed the information to fester, fueling a determination to turn the pain into progress as I threw myself deeper into studies and shifts. But the isolation amplified when friends planned Thanksgiving trips and I opted for a solo shift at the cafe for extra pay, the empty dorm echoing with what-ifs about bridges I might have burned too soon. In a moment of clever retribution that eased the building tension without direct confrontation, I recalled Jake's recent social media boasts about the truck's reliability, complete with photos from his delivery routes. And knowing the local mechanic from my high school diner days, a gruff guy named Hank who'd once covered for me during a family emergency, I made an anonymous call suggesting a check on potential recall issues with the brakes, framing it as a concerned tip from a fellow owner to avoid any suspicion. The inspection that followed sidelined the truck for a full day of unnecessary diagnostics and minor fixes that drained Dad's wallet and Jake's weekend plans, their frustrated calls home filtering through mutual friends who laughed about the diva vehicle acting up, and when Mom mentioned it during our next check-in, I offered syrupy sympathy over the phone about how even future-proof machines had their quirks, the subtle satisfaction warming me as I hung up and returned to my notes. That small victory steadied me amid the growing distance, but the real jolt came mid-semester during a routine check-in with the scholarship office, where the advisor pulled me aside with a furrowed brow and explained a flagged discrepancy in my family's reported financials that didn't align with the independent status I'd claimed, questioning if there had been any unreported support or changes that might affect my aid package. The words hit like a cold splash, my mind racing to whether Mom or Dad had tampered with records in some misguided attempt to help or sabotage, tying back to those debt papers and the protective instincts they'd shown Jake, leaving me pacing the office hallway afterward with a knot of uncertainty about how to respond without unraveling the fragile independence I'd built. As evening fell and my phone lit up with an unexpected voicemail from Jake, his voice tentative, mentioning he'd heard about the flag from home and wanted to talk, I deleted it without listening. The accumulating clues pointing to entanglements I wasn't ready to face, the suspense of impending revelations hanging heavy as I headed back to the dorm, wondering what bomb this latest twist would detonate next in the fragile balance of my new life. Sophomore year unfolded like a marathon where every step tested the endurance I'd built from that initial breakaway from home, with the Ohio State campus transforming from a novel landscape into a demanding routine of nursing labs that demanded precision with simulated patients and anatomy models, all while the scholarship's GPA requirement loomed like a strict overseer, ensuring I couldn't afford a single slip amid the juggling of classes and those endless cafe shifts that left my feet aching and my mind buzzing with caffeine fumes. The family calls had become sporadic rituals, sandwiched between my study marathons and the occasional hangout with Sarah and the nursing girls who formed a makeshift support network, their stories of parental pep talks contrasting sharply with Mom's updates that inevitably circled back to Jake's warehouse promotions fueled by the truck's reliability in bad weather deliveries, her tone carrying that unspoken judgment as if my independent scramble was somehow less legitimate than his cushioned start. I'd respond with measured positivity, sharing snippets of my clinical rotations where I'd first handled real stethoscopes on actual patients during volunteer hours at the university clinic. But the conversations always ended with her probing questions about whether I was eating enough or making friends, hints of concern laced with the underlying narrative that home remained the safer harbor even as their choices had pushed me adrift. The isolation crept in during quieter moments, like when the dorm emptied for fall break and I stayed behind to pick up extra hours, the silence amplifying doubts about whether severing those ties so cleanly had been a bold move or just a lonely one, especially with the debt discovery from Dad's papers still gnawing at me like an unsolved puzzle piece. Pushing through the grind, I focused on the small victories that kept the fire alive, such as nailing a group project on patient care ethics, where my real-world hustle from the diner days lent authenticity to our presentation, earning nods from the professor that boosted my confidence amid the sea of privileged peers who breezed in with family-backed laptops and worry-free schedules. Jake's unexpected call shattered the routine one drizzly Tuesday afternoon as I trudged back from a lecture hall, the phone vibrating in my pocket with his name flashing, his voice emerging hesitant and stripped of the old bravado when I answered from a bench under the library awning, rain pattering on the leaves overhead as he admitted he'd been reflecting on things and missed our sibling banter, suggesting he could drive up in the truck for a visit if I wasn't too swamped. The offer caught me off guard, stirring a mix of wariness and reluctant warmth because he'd always been the favored one without malice. Just a kid riding the wave of parental priorities, and as we talked through the static of the line about his monotonous warehouse shifts and my internship prospects, I let slip details about the scholarship flag from the previous semester. How the office had scrutinized our family's finances like I was hiding some windfall support. He paused then, the rain intensifying as if mirroring the tension, before confessing that Dad had gotten oddly defensive about it during a family dinner. Muttering something about not wanting to complicate my aid by revealing their ongoing payments toward Uncle Ray's old business fallout, a mess from the 90s that had swallowed savings and left Dad paranoid about financial disclosures tainting anyone's opportunities. That revelation twisted the knife deeper, painting their favoritism not as casual oversight, but a deliberate strategy born from past scars. With Jake positioned as the secure investment to safeguard the family legacy while I was deemed the resilient outlier who could navigate without the safety net, his admission carrying a hint of his own regret for staying silent during those early decisions. We wrapped the call with plans for him to visit the following month, an uneasy bridge forming over the chasm, but the information fermented in my thoughts during the weeks that followed, fueling late-night journal entries where I dissected how Uncle Ray's failed venture, a botched auto parts startup that tanked amid economic dips, had ripple effects still echoing in our lives, making Dad's protectiveness toward Jake feel like overcompensation that sidelined me entirely. The dilemma of family loyalty versus self-preservation weighed heavier as midterms loomed, my performance dipping slightly from the distraction until I refocused with help from study groups, emerging stronger, but with that lingering question of whether Jake's outreach was genuine reconciliation or just a band-aid on wounds they all pretended weren't bleeding. As December approached with its festive campus lights and holiday buzz that everyone else embraced, I crafted a piece of revenge that blended wit with a touch of exposure, turning the annual family newsletter Mom sent to relatives into an opportunity for subtle counterbalance without descending into outright conflict. Drawing from the glowing progress reports I'd received in nursing, I composed an elaborate update email to the extended family chain, detailing my academic triumphs with straight A's in core courses, a coveted spot in the advanced clinical track, and even fabricating a vague, independent grant from alumni donors that had eased my financial load, attaching a professional photo of me in scrubs during a mock procedure to underscore the narrative of thriving solo. The responses poured in swiftly from aunts and cousins, filled with admiration and queries about my secret to success, while back home the ripple hit during a holiday gathering where mutual friends relayed Mom and Dad's discomfort at the barbecue circuit, fielding compliments they couldn't reciprocate without admitting the uneven support, Jake texting me later with a thumbs-up emoji he'd quickly deleted in favor of, "They're tying themselves in knots over your story. Nice one." That quiet triumph circulated a spark of justice through my veins, easing the holiday solitude as I worked a double shift on Christmas Eve. The cafe's twinkling lights a poor substitute for family warmth, but a reminder of the path I'd carved despite their shadows. Yet stability proved fleeting when Mom materialized on my dorm doorstep one biting January afternoon, her coat dusted with snow from the drive and eyes shadowed as if she hadn't slept, announcing she'd come to talk because the weight of past choices had become too heavy to ignore any longer. Her words spilled in the cramped room with Sarah tactfully absent, apologies mingling with fragments of explanation about the debt's toll and how they'd misjudged my strength. But before I could probe deeper, her gaze landed on my wall calendar where the graduation date stood circled in red, prompting a murmured promise to make amends by ensuring I got the recognition I deserved at the ceremony. The vagueness of her intent hung in the air like unspoken conditions, stirring dilemmas about whether to accept this overture or guard the boundaries I'd fought to establish, especially with Jake's visit looming and the scholarship office still watchful. As she departed with a tentative hug that felt more like obligation than connection, the encounter left me unsettled in the emptying hallway, the accumulating layers of family secrets and half-truths building toward an uncertain horizon where reconciliation dangled just out of reach. teasing the conflicts yet to fully erupt as my junior year beckoned with its own intensifying demands. Junior year accelerated the pace of my nursing program into a relentless cycle of clinical rotations that immersed me in the controlled chaos of hospital wards, where the beeps of monitors and the hurried footsteps of staff became the soundtrack to learning how to manage real patients with everything from 4 drips to emotional breakdowns, all while the scholarship's unyielding standards pushed me to maintain excellence amid sleep-deprived nights and the persistent undercurrent of family tensions that refused to fade despite the miles between Ohio State and our suburban home. I'd risen to the challenge by securing a spot in the advanced practicum where hands-on experience with diverse cases sharpened my skills and opened doors to internship recommendations. But the solitude deepened as peers celebrated milestones with parental fanfare, and I navigated holidays through video calls that skimmed the surface of Mom's unannounced visit, lingering like an unresolved chord. Her January appearance had stirred a whirlwind of mixed feelings, with apologies that hinted at regret over the Truc favoritism and the death shadow, but stopped short of full disclosure, leaving me to wonder during long shifts if her calendar glance at graduation was a genuine bid for redemption or merely a way to ease her own conscience without truly upending the family dynamics that had favored Jake so blatantly. The humor I injected into conversations with Sarah and the cohort, quipping about my self-made saga, where every achievement felt like defying gravity, masked the growing ache of disconnection, especially as Jake's texts grew more frequent with updates on his warehouse promotions that now included supervisory duties thanks to the truck's role in reliable transports. His messages carrying an undercurrent of envy for my progress that suggested cracks in his once unquestioned position. Spring break arrived with a deceptive calm, the campus thinning out as students scattered to warmer escapes while I opted for a few days at a budget motel near the clinic to rack up volunteer hours. But Jake's sudden drop-in at the cafe mid-shift upended that plan, his truck pulling up outside with a familiar rumble that drew my eye through the window amid the lunch rush of steaming sandwiches and clinking mugs. He looked more seasoned than the high school kid I'd left behind, lines of fatigue from early mornings etching his face as he slid into a booth and waited for my break, ordering a black coffee that steamed between us while he dove into the purpose of his visit without preamble, admitting over the bitter brew that Dad's explanations about the debt had always painted a picture of necessary sacrifices, with Uncle Ray's 90s fiasco, a collapsed auto parts scheme fueled by overambitious loans, still draining resources through legal fees and repayments that made every family decision feel like a high-stakes gamble. The twist unfolded as he confessed his unwitting complicity, recalling overheated family dinners where he nodded along to the narrative of investing in his stability to avoid repeating past mistakes, positioning me as the independent force who wouldn't buckle under pressure, a role that now left him grappling with the unfairness as his own path plateaued in the warehouse grind while I surged ahead in nursing. That admission hung heavy in the cafe's hum, stirring a complex brew of empathy for his position and lingering resentment for the years it had enabled the imbalance. Our conversation stretching through refills as he extended an invitation to Dad's upcoming birthday party back home, framing it as a chance to air things out in person rather than letting the distance calcify the rifts further. The dilemma tugged at me during the drive back to the dorm afterward, Jake's truck fading in the rearview as I weighed the risks of returning to that familiar terrain where old patterns might resurface like weeds through pavement. But curiosity about piecing together the full debt story outweighed the caution, leading me to accept with the caveat that I'd keep interactions light to avoid derailing my momentum. Preparing for the event, I unearthed an old family snapshot from a storage box Sarah had helped me unpack, the image capturing us at a county fair years earlier with me in awkward pigtails and Jake as a toddler on Dad's shoulders. Parents beaming in that pre-debt haze of optimism, and in a stroke of clever revenge that aimed to highlight the hypocrisy without confrontation. I polished it digitally on the library computer and shared it across our relatives' social circle with a caption evoking roots that branched unevenly yet still bloomed resiliently, tagging it with themes of family quirks and personal growth that invited interpretations without spelling out the favoritism. The post gained traction overnight, cousins commenting with supportive nods to my journey and subtle questions about the uneven paths, creating a buzz that reached the party venue, a backyard gathering with string lights and a rented grill, where I arrived to find Mom and Dad navigating the fallout amid potato salad and small talk, their explanations for my solo success coming out strained as aunts probed for details on the support that apparently hadn't extended equally. Watching from the sidelines with a plastic cup of punch, I caught Jake's amused glance across the crowd, his quick text confirming they'd been fielding the implications all week, the witty exposure delivering a satisfying undercurrent of accountability that lightened the air without exploding into accusations. As the evening progressed with toasts to Dad's milestone and stories of better times, the conflict simmered beneath the surface until Mom drew me aside into the dimly lit garage where tools hung like silent witnesses on the walls, her voice dropping to a confidential hush as she revealed she'd driven to the university dean's office the previous week, pleading with him to highlight my name during the graduation ceremony as a way to publicly acknowledge the oversight with the truck and tuition, insisting that the family wanted to make reparations through whatever recognition or support could salvage the bonds strained by years of missteps. Her eyes searched mine for forgiveness amid the confessions of how the debt paranoia had blinded them to my potential, treating Jake as the fragile link to security while underestimating my capacity. But the plea felt layered with self-interest, raising questions about whether this spotlight was truly for me or a performative fix to quiet the relatives' whispers now amplified by my post. Dad wandered in moments later, catching fragments of the exchange with a gruff acknowledgement that perhaps they'd gotten it wrong, the tension thickening the garage air like exhaust from Jake's idling truck outside. But before responses could form, I excused myself, citing a long drive back, stepping into the cooling night where the party's laughter faded behind me. Spotting Mom's car keys glinting on the truck's dashboard as I passed, evidence she'd tailed me somehow for this intervention, the realization deepened the intrigue, hinting at a more orchestrated effort to reel me in just as my independence peaked, leaving me to navigate the highway home with the engine's drone mirroring the unresolved turmoil, the facade of family unity cracking wider, and teasing the climactic confrontations that graduation would inevitably force into the open. Graduation week descended upon the Ohio State campus with an electric fervor that transformed the familiar pathways into bustling corridors of anticipation, where clusters of students in crisp caps and flowing gowns milled about exchanging hugs and final exam war stories, while families converged from every direction with bouquets and video cameras at the ready, creating a tapestry of collective triumph that both inspired and underscored my solitary navigation through the throngs as I adjusted the tassel on my mortarboard and clutched the program outlining the ceremony's order. For years of unyielding pursuit had culminated in this moment, with my nursing degree secured through scholarships renewed semester after semester and a stack of internship offers from hospitals impressed by my clinical rotations and unwavering GPA. Yet the undercurrents of family discord rippled beneath the surface excitement, Mom's garage revelation from the birthday party echoing in my mind like a half-resolved chord that blended her pleas for spotlight recognition with the deeper admissions about the debt's distorting influence on their priorities. I'd chosen to attend alone, politely declining Jake's offer to ferry me in the truck that symbolized so much of the imbalance, preferring the independence of my modest sedan parked on the outskirts where I could slip in unnoticed amid the sea of supporters. My thoughts drifting to the series of witty revenges that had dotted the journey, from the borrowed keys to the viral family photo, each one a quiet assertion of agency that now felt like stepping stones leading to this platform of personal vindication. The air hummed with speeches from dignitaries and the rustle of programs as seats filled in the massive stadium, and as I took my place in the alphabetical line with fellow graduates buzzing about post-ceremony brunches, a flicker of uncertainty stirred when I scanned the bleachers for familiar faces, not out of longing but curiosity, about whether Mom had followed through on her dean's office visit or if the family's patterns of selective support would keep them absent even now. The ceremony commenced with the dean's resonant voice booming over the speakers, welcoming the sea of caps and invoking themes of resilience forged in the fires of adversity. his words landing with particular weight during a segment on overcoming familial obstacles where he quipped about the unique strengths drawn from those who built their paths brick by unassisted brick, drawing polite laughter from the crowd that masked the personal resonance for me as I shifted in my seat envisioning the trucks gleam in our old driveway as the stark emblem of those very obstacles. Names began rolling out in measured cadence. Each announcement met with cheers from designated sections, and as the H's approached with my heart steady but alert, I caught a peripheral movement in the front rows where an usher guided a lone figure through the aisle, Mom, unmistakable in her out-of-place Sunday dress and coat that looked travel-worn from the drive, her posture tense as she leaned toward the dean during a brief pause, whispering urgently with gestures that conveyed desperation amid the formal proceedings. The realization hit as my name echoed next over the loudspeaker, Emily Harper, pulling me to my feet for the walk across the stage where spotlights warmed the platform and the audience blurred into a wave of applause. But in that suspended stride with the diploma presented in a firm handshake, I locked eyes with her across the divide, her face a canvas of regret etched deeper by the public setting she'd orchestrated yet couldn't fully control. That visual convergence crystallized the emotional vortex swirling within me, a potent mix of vindication for the independence I'd clawed from their neglect and a pang of pity for the unraveling woman who'd prioritized Jake's future chariot over my educational foothold. Her presence now begging for the acknowledgement she'd denied me years earlier in that kitchen conversation about spare dollars. Rather than rush down to her side in a rush of reconciliation or confrontation, I paused at the podium's edge as protocol allowed a brief moment for graduates to soak in the milestone, offering instead a deliberate, measured nod in her direction that carried layers of unspoken commentary, the poised recognition of her effort laced with the silent declaration that I'd spotlighted myself through sheer will, no borrowed light required. The gesture landed with subtle power, her shoulders slumping slightly as the dean patted her arm in awkward consolation, while the ceremony resumed, the witty finality of it delivering a rush of satisfaction that coursed through me like the culmination of every small payback along the way, from the mechanic's tip to the newsletter fabrication, each one building toward this elegant severance where I stepped off the stage into the embrace of my classmates' congratulations without glancing back. Jake materialized shortly after in the milling crowd outside, weaving through clusters of families with a quick hug and a murmured, "You owned that up there, sis," his eyes flicking toward Mom who hovered at the periphery. The brief alliance we'd forged over his confessions adding a layer of complexity to the moment as he admitted Dad had stayed home nursing a cold, but sent regrets laced with pride he couldn't voice directly. The post-ceremony gathering unfolded in fragmented exchanges near the stadium's edge, with Mom approaching through the dispersing throng, her voice tentative as she expressed the drive's purpose, to witness the fruition of the potential they'd underestimated, and delved into partial truths about the debt's origins, how Uncle Ray's venture collapse had instilled a fear-driven calculus that funneled resources toward Jake as the presumed steady heir while casting me as the adaptable survivor who wouldn't falter without intervention. Her narrative wove in admissions of gender-tinged assumptions from their generation, the truck not just a gift, but a misguided anchor in uncertain times, yet the explanations trailed into ambiguities that left key motivations shrouded, such as whether the favoritism stemmed purely from economic paranoia or deeper resentments tied to family histories they'd never fully unpacked. Jake chimed in with his perspective, owning how silence had perpetuated the divide, and expressing a newfound respect for the grit that had carried me through. But as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the caps littering the grass, the conversation circled without closure, dilemmas surfacing about the feasibility of mending bonds fractured over years of selective nurturing. I listened with a measured calm, the diploma heavy in my bag as a tangible emblem of self-reliance, pondering the costs of potential forgiveness against the freedom of forward momentum, especially with internship relocations beckoning to cities far from Ohio's familiar constraints. Driving away in my sedan as the stadium lights flickered on against the twilight, the rearview mirror captured their figures waving from the parking lot, Mom's hand lingering longest, Jake's beside her in tentative solidarity, growing smaller until they blurred into the distance, the engine's hum underscoring the lingering questions that refused easy answers about whether the damage ran too deep for reconciliation or if time might soften the edges of those old wounds. Triumph tasted bittersweet in that departure, a hard-won closure shadowed by the what-ifs of alternate family paths and the subtle clues of unresolved secrets, leaving the road ahead open to choices that balanced independence with the pull of blood ties. An ambiguity that invited reflection on the true price of rising above without looking back entirely.